The presentation will be in English, but we have there's an opportunity to grab a headset and follow it in Galaslisut as well. Unfortunately, the Galaslisut interpretation won't reach the live streaming. We don't have the equipment for that. But in the room, it is possible. So, just a few practicalities before I do my presentation of our speaker today. We will start, and Susie will speak for about an hour. Maybe turn off the sound, Gitte. An hour, give or take. And there will be a short break for coffee and tea and maybe to reflect on the presentation. And then we'll have time for questions and comments afterwards. So with that, I want to say that it's an honor and a great pleasure to welcome Susie Basil. Susie is of Atikamekw First Nation origin, and she's a professor at the School of Indigenous Studies at Université de Quebec, habité Atikamekw, at Val d'Or campus. And in 2017, Susie set up a research laboratory in Indigenous women's issues, Miigwetsin. And since January 1st, in 2020, she holds a Canada Research Chair in Indigenous women's issues. Since 2010, she's a member of the Steering Committee of Aboriginal Peoples Research and Knowledge Work Network Dialogue. And since June 1st in 2016, she's a member of the QAT University Research Ethics Board. Between 2017 and 19, she was a co-director of the research sector at the Public Inquiry Commission on Relations between Indigenous Peoples and Certain Public Services, Listening, Reconciliation, and Progress, known as the Viens Commission. From 2019 to 2022, she sat on the board and on the Ethics Commission. She sat on the board and on the Ethics and Scientific Integrity Committee of the Fonds de Recherche de Québec, Société et Culture. Since 2022, she has co-chaired the task force to ensure the leadership of Indigenous peoples in research at the Fonds de Recherche de Québec. Since 2020, Susie is a member of the reference group for the appropriate review of Indigenous research in Canada. She is the co-author of a report published in November 2022 on free and informed consent and imposed sterilizations among First Nations and Inuit women in Quebec. Susie comes from the Atikamekw community of Wemutachi in Quebec, Canada. I practiced this, but I didn't do that well. So thank you so much for coming, Susie, and for wanting to share this with us, and I'll now give the word to you.
Thank you very much, Inge. You practice very well. There is many Indigenous words in this presentation. So, hello, bonjour, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak to you here at Ilisimatusarfik as a former student in this university back in 1996, if my memory is good. I'm always very happy to come back to Greenland, to Nuuk, and to meet with the new colleagues, people, and also with the old ones. So today I will talk to you about Indigenous women, environmental issues, and link to the land. It's issues that I have been working on since a good 15 years now, and well, hopefully you will find it a bit interesting. So the first part of my presentation is taken from the chapter I published in the book Feminist Perspectives in International Relations, Think of the World Differently, published by Maïka Sodanji. And this book was published in French, unfortunately for you, last year. So I made an English version of this text. In case of you would like to read it, I can provide it to you. But here today I will present you a part of that work. Indigenous women have a unique connection with the land, key element of the colonial quest in the world, because of their sense of responsibility towards it, their symbiotic vision of all its elements, and their vital role in the continuation, transmissions of the knowledge attached to it. As stated by Marlene Hale from the Wet'suwet'en First Nation, she said, "We Indigenous women will not go quietly, nor stop defending our land and cultural values until we see solutions." These words set the tone of a series of actions undertaken by Indigenous people in Canada and elsewhere to protect the land and voice their demands. Case in point, some members of the Wet'suwet'en First Nations people whose unceded ancestral territories in the northern British Columbia set up a roadside checkpoint to block a proposed gas pipeline from Alberta to Canada West Coast. This action sparked a series of anti-pipeline protests that started in 2009 and culminated in a near paralysis of Canadian rail transportation in the winter of 2020. What we might have been initially considered as an isolated event, or merely one of the many Indigenous causes, has become a pan-Canadian movement of solidarity. In fact, this movement is reminiscent of the 1990 standoff in Oka between the Mohawk First Nations and the Quebec government, and the Idle No More movement in 2012. I know you know what is this movement here in Greenland. But this time around is characterized by the strong support of a large number of non-Indigenous Canadian citizens and a global media coverage. Understanding these mobilizations through their intersections with gendered dynamics is crucial to the understanding of colonial ties and feminist studies. A true process of decolonizations will need to recognize, most importantly, the discrimination experiences by Indigenous women and the normalized invisibility of their unique knowledge. Indigenous people share a common experience of colonialism, which began with territorial dispossession through the doctrine of terra nullius, or nobody's land, followed by the oppression of societies and their systems of governance through the invisibilizations of women, amongst other things, and the creations of individuals dependent on dominant society in the making through the creations of reserve in Canada, for example. According to the Mi'kmaq professor Sherry Pictou, this process must begin with the recognition of colonialism and coloniality in Canada, not to be confused with its historical notion viewed as an event belonging to the past only. She adds, "The final report of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Woman and Girl Inquiry, released on June 3rd, 2019, raises concern about how patriarchy and colonial governance system are linked to causes of gender discrimination and violence. A certain type of colonialism are still present today, and some of them have also permeated Indigenous societies and communities who have internalized colonial practices and ideologies, often unwittingly. For example, the male-dominated Indigenous leadership in the 1980s, labeled as a traitors, anti-Indigenous and individualistic, the Indigenous woman who spoke out against gender discrimination and called for legislative changes in the Indian Act, still in force today in Canada. The process of decolonization inevitably involves the recognition that discrimination expected by experienced by Indigenous women is different from that of the men. Kuokkanen did a lot of work on this issue. She's from the Sami people. On this point, the Quebec Native Women's Association stresses that gender-blind policies and practices in consultations and decision-making processes give rise to the systemic exclusion of women on a global scale. Indeed, these women have a very specific experience of colonialism by targeting them in a multiple attempt of extinction. Many cases of forced sterilizations have been documented around the world. And assimilation through the compulsory internment of children in Indigenous residential schools in many countries. The reinstatements of women's role in the governance of their communities, their societies, and the land they occupy will lead to a genuine decolonizations in an indigenous context. Sorry about that. In deep and timeless connections of indigenous peoples to their land distinguishes itself by the fact that, for them, human being belongs to the land and not the other way around. Indigenous women maintain and transmit, as best as they can, a universe of knowledge relating to this notion, but which is constantly undermined by the appropriations of indigenous land. Between 2017 and 2020, more than 500 indigenous activists in 19 countries were murdered. And on that number, one of the 9 persons were women. For example, am I right? Yeah. For example, a part of the implementations of the North American Free Trade Agreement, the Mexican government amended its constitution, which resulted in the privatizations of indigenous land and the revocations of women's rights to inherit the land. The exploitations of natural resources, which runs counter to traditional activities, is also a threat, as is in significant increase in sexual violence against indigenous women near mining sites in many Latin American countries. Environmental contamination, which characterize extractivism activities, further erodes the disconnections. For example, extractive activities and deforestation are activities that are going on in many indigenous land. And for example, the community of Grassy Narrow in Canada, Northern Ontario, had its water contaminated by mercury as a result of a mine tangling dam branch, causing intergenerational poisoning from mother to children. So indigenous women's expectation, here are a few. Return to basics through the protections of land, water, and resources for their children, families, communities, nation, and for the whole world. Their expected responsibilities, healing the wound inflicted by colonialism, and hope of regaining balance. And this hope of regaining balance, it's coming back constantly in all the interviews I'm doing with indigenous women on different issues. Global issues especially affecting indigenous women, as you may know, climate change, adverse impacted of its acceleration, and also climate change have more not climate change, but more female deaths in environmental disasters around the world. Disconnected causes caused by loss of biodiversity and forced abandonment of sustenance activities affect the health of indigenous women. Also, food insecurity mainly affected indigenous women. If we look at the studies that have been done on the issue recently. compromises consumptions of traditional food. We notice this challenge a lot in a very important way in northern Canada, especially. So, solutions. One of them, it's a full and effective participations of Indigenous people, particularly Indigenous women, in consultations and decision-making. Respect of the notion of free, prior, and informed consent, which is a pillar of the United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous People. The second solution that, and I didn't made or set up this solution myself. I heard many women who share this wish with me. So the second solution is the integrations of a gender-based analysis, intersectional approach, with an intersectional approach, ethnicity and colonial experience during the study of issues faced by Indigenous people. And the other part of that second solution is both through the implementations of tools at the international level and in the development of laws and policies on the exploitations of resources at the local level. So these solutions are not new. They just need to be repeated again and again, because we unfortunately face problem or where women are not always listened when they are expressing their needs, such as these one. The second part of my presentation is about a specific research project that we just finished a few months ago. And it's on the consolidations of the link to the land of Indigenous women through pregnancies and childbirth. Here I quoted one of the lady elders that we met during an interview, an Innu woman. Innu, not Inuit, Innu has a First Nations of northeast Quebec. And she said, our own tewagan, which is a drum, is our placenta. And this phrase means a lot. As you may know, drums are an instrument or object that is very well respected in many Indigenous nations around the world. And that elders made a comparison with her placenta. So it's show the deepness of the sacred aspect of both the drum and the placenta. Amongst the result of my PhD thesis, this subject of pregnancy and childbirth emerged unexpectedly. When I met with 32 Atikamekw First Nation women, the elders were telling me their path on the land through the pregnancies and deliveries they had on the land. And it was very, wonderful stories to hear. And this is how this specific research project came. So for Indigenous women, and in this case Atikamekw Nation, pregnancies and childbirth were powerful spatio-temporal markers consolidating the link to the land, in a context where deliveries have moved from the territory to the hospital environment. The objective of this research were: the first one was to verify to what extent the link to the land has been transformed by government programs and health policies imposed without consulting Indigenous women. The second one was to determine the extent to which Indigenous women links to the land could be actualized and revitalize the leaderships and governance practices formerly associated with pregnancy and childbirth. And finally, the third objective was to document the practices and measures taken to consolidate the link between children and the territory now that delivery is taking place in the cities. Here is a map of Quebec, First Nation and Inuit people. And then, oh yeah, you can see my... so the two Innu community that we worked with are Inquanshit and Natashquan, which are based here on the north shore of the St. Lawrence River. And the third community is an Atikamekw community called Obijuan, which is trying to reach here. Sorry, I couldn't find a way to make a red mark or whatever to show these three communities on the map. So that's the part of the world that I'm talking about. So shed new light on the context of this new research that came out from my PhD thesis was in the context of shed a new light on the role of Indigenous women in governing their health and nation. The consolidations of Indigenous women's link to the land through pregnancies and childbirth is one of the most hidden dimensions of realities of Indigenous peoples. Very little documented, this subject arouses key interest amongst Indigenous women and the researchers involved, such as me. The impact of the sedentarizations of these three communities still felt today. So we conducted interviews. This project was funded by the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada, and of course we also had the ethical certifications from my university. So we conducted 9 interviews with Innu women, so 5 from Inquanshit and 4 from Natashquan in 2020. And 6 interviews were done with the Atikamekw women from Obijuan in 2021. And yes, it was the COVID time in Quebec as well. Don't worry about that. But we found ways to meet with these elders. One of the funny side of the COVID was that many Indigenous and the elders, and maybe non-Indigenous as well, found new technologies very useful. So they appropriate themselves, use Zoom and Teams and those technologies. So it was quite funny to held some of the interviews by Zoom with the elders who got help, of course, from members of their family. But it was a challenge, a nice challenge. So in total, 15 interviews were conducted in between 20 and 21 with elders who were born between 1931 and 1966. And as I just said, the timeline, because of the COVID pandemic, it took us 2 more years to accomplish this research. We are currently in the process of, well, we finished the validation part of the content of the research, of the findings, and now it's going under translation into English. So the 15 women we talked to or have had interview with, they help us and allowed us to better understand their experiences of pregnancy and childbirth. And they wanted also to, we wanted also to document their practices on the land as well as their transformation, and also determine how these women were affected by colonial rules. So the main findings of this research: many government interventions have definitely accelerated the sedentarizations as well as imposed hospitalizations, and undeniably conducted to the erosion of a whole social system related to life on the land, as well as undermining the importance of childbirth on the land, and modifying the territoriality of Innu and Atikamekw women. An analysis of the participants' testimonies shows how the shift in practices for accompanying pregnant women from the land to the community and then from the community to the hospital, has led to the loss of midwifery practices as well as accelerating the imposition of a biomedical vision of pregnancy. These multiple relocations of birthing environments have precipitated the gradual loss of control that pregnant women could exercise over their delivery. Nevertheless, the Innu and Atikamekw women linked to the land has not been lost but transformed. We unfortunately heard many negative experiences from these elders. Innu and Atikamekw women have had negative experiences in the health care system in Quebec. They were not told to the reasons for certain decisions about their health. They also faced the introductions of formula milk. Most of them wanted to breastfeed their baby, but they were told to not do so. Some have undergone forced sterilizations, and cases it was a tubal ligation without knowing it after C-sections or most of the time. Loss of children. Some of the women lost children in the health system. They were told that the children was dead without knowing the reasons of the death, without a death certificate, or the possibility of seeing the body of the child. Doubt persists about the true story of these children, and I will come back about that later on. Add to this the pressures exerted by religion to control women's body. There is a significant literature in English about this subject if you wish to go further. Taking control of the stage of life under the guise of government policy, and above all, the methods used to implement such control, such as substitutions and marginalizations of midwife knowledge by medical professions, medicalizations of pregnancies, imposed travel to hospital, etc., have considerably affected the possibilities for Indigenous mothers to exercise their free will and have altogether altered the responsibility of families as well as the birthing support as practices since time immemorial, and of the which the midwives were once one of the cornerstones. Far from remaining passive, despite the shift to hospital deliveries and the abandonment of certain practices, the Innu and Atikamekw women interviewed have instead become the guardian of the knowledge related to their occupations of the land and the practices associated with it. The reintroduction of practice of midwifery, as well as certain ceremonies and ritual in the community, such as ceremony of the newborn, or the first step ceremonies, or the disposal of the umbilical cord and the placenta, was identified as a means of consolidating the link to the land for Innu and Atikamekw women. The need to inform the younger generation about significant places on the land and the transmission and knowledge on the making of medicines from traditional plants and traditional objects related to pregnancy and childbirth was emphasized by the women we met. Here I had some pictures of what I'm talking about. The Tikinagan, which is the one on the left side, is with a wooden board, and the Mizaspizun, this one, is without the wooden board. But the idea is to, wrap the baby into this traditional board. These practices, considered archaic, have long been discouraged by doctors who saw them as a danger. The strengthening of this connection by the new generations necessarily requires the valorizations of women's leadership in the life circle, from birth to death through childbirth. So this is how it looks with the newborn baby, twins in this case. enhancement of the use of traditions. The making of traditional objects for young children, such as the tikinagan, involves knowing the species of the tree needed, where in the territory to obtain it, and what time of the year to go sampling it, etc. As with traditional medicines, these gestures involve a body of knowledge related to the resources of the territory. Is it also a whole way of conceiving the care of children that is expressed through these objects because of the almost continuous contact between mother and child? Generally speaking, and beyond the issue of Indigenous women's power over their own bodies, the bond between Indigenous mothers and children has been under attack for over 5 generations. This is a quote from Shaham, a very interesting text. Consequently, the necessary reclaiming of power by Indigenous women over their reproductive health becomes a priority in the ultimate goal of a return to governance by and for Indigenous people. This report is about 120 pages long, so I really made it, short and sweet for today. But as soon as it's available in English, I can make sure that Inga receive a copy, and it will be, accessible online anyway as well. I will end slowly my presentation with short presentations of abstract of past and undergoing research that I'm currently working on. And as you can see, the issue of the link to the land can bring us to unexpected place, such as topics of research that I will introduce you. The first one is a research that we finished last year about the political involvement of Indigenous women in Quebec. We did 20 interviews with former elected women, or as a chief or as a councillor. And it was very interesting to document this issue in Quebec in French, in English as well, for the first time. The most literature are coming from out west Canada and elsewhere around the world, but nothing was written about the specific situations of Quebec. So due to the erasure of their place in community governance, a few women in politics still today, available data from 2009 and 2021 shows that Indigenous women's political involvement in Quebec has increased from 27% to 37% over the last 12 years. Also, case studies carried out in Western Canada, like I just said, but practically nothing in Quebec. Documenting the journey of the First Nations, the first female chiefs in Quebec in the 90s. In fact, the first woman chief in Quebec was elected in 1992. And we also met with other women that were grand chief or held other kinds of position. And the coincidence was that this research was nearly done in 2021, and in 2021 we had I don't know how many Indigenous women elected in Canada as chiefs of the Assembly of First Nations, as a Governor General of Canada, at the Senate as well. So it was a year of a new wave, I will say, of female leadership. And what is important to know, and I forgot to mention it here, is that it was prohibited for Indigenous women to do politics before 1951, when the Indian Act was amended and permit women to assist to public assembly or be in politics or be elected. So this 70 years of new or permission, if I may say it like that, still have an effect today because 25% of the elected people, Indigenous people in Canada are women only. So we still have a work to do, I will say. The other project, research project that we also finished a few weeks ago, it's about the access to midwifery services for Indigenous communities in Quebec. The majority of Indigenous women who have no choice, in fact, but to seek perinatal services outside their communities. And here I have to make a point about the exceptions of Inuit of Nunavik and AU, so Cree people from northern Quebec, who have access to midwifery services and programs, which is very good. We can relate it to the agreement, the Northern Quebec agreement that they have signed in 1975, that gives them much more latitude and, of course, money to implement what they want and what they need. So hopefully the other 39 communities, Indigenous communities in Quebec, will one day have access to these services. The other point is the vital role of midwives was undermined by the imposed over-medicalizations. As you heard in my other research project, women were they all had something to say or an experience about this feeling of over-medicalizations when they had to give birth in hospital. Funding remains a major issue, even if midwifery services are a need for Indigenous women. This is the main obstacle to the implementations of those services. And it's also the case for non-Native women in certain area of Quebec. So it's not only not accessible for Indigenous women. So we did 27 interviews with Indigenous health departments and organizations, and I can come back one day to present you the findings of this specific research. The two last one are about inform. And oops, there is a little mistake. I'm sorry about that. So inform and free, free and informed consent and imposed sterilizations amongst First Nations and Inuit women in Quebec. We met 35 women mainly, which is much more than we expected at the beginning. 9 cases of, amongst these 35 testimonies, 9 cases of imposed sterilizations, plus 13 cases of imposed sterilizations and other obstetric violence. 6 cases of obstetric violence without imposed sterilizations. We wanted to hear these testimony as well. 3 cases of forced abortion. And we also met with 4 witnesses, people who worked in the health system in the past who were witness of certain situations, or husband of women who have passed, and knowing well their story, they absolutely wanted to share it with us. So we, of course, accept to hear these person, as it was done in the few commissions and inquiries that happened in Canada since the last few years. It's possible to share the story of someone else from your close family. The majority were between 17 and 33 years old when they were sterilized. The last case of imposed sterilizations reported, 2019. This is yesterday. And we are currently preparing the phase 2 of that research, because since the release of the report last November, there is not a week where we don't hear from someone who's contacting us to say, me too, me too, me too. I'm ready to speak now. I would like to share my story. So my experience. So we should start this phase 2 sometime in June. And I'm expecting so far probably more than 35 other testimonies. We'll see how it goes, but yeah, it's a very hard issue to work on, but necessary. And the last research, in this case it's not a research project yet, it may become, But I am closely working with the Awashak Association. Awashak means children in Atikamekw and many other languages, indigenous languages as well. And in fact, it's not, well, I say children because it's a short way, but the real translation is little being of light. It's nice, I think. So the Awashak Association was set up about 2 years ago, and they work on the mysterious disappearances of children in the Quebec health system back in the 50s, 60s, and some cases from the 70s. So far, from a few days ago, the numbers of 138 cases of babies and young children disappeared in the health system in Quebec, following hospitalizations between, like I said, the 50s and the 70s. For most of them, no documentations available, medical record or death certificate. The family never heard the real reasons of the disappearance. And no information either from about the transfer of establishments or circumstances of the death or place of burial. So none of these kind of information were given to the families. And since last year, the Quebec government passed the Bill 79, and that bill authorized the communications of personal information to the families of children, of Indigenous children. It unlocked the medical files and the religious archives as well. And as far as I know, these religious archives are not very open to share anything, but the law is there, the bill, sorry, it's there to for the cause, to help. So as I said, I work with this association because they asked me if I could, under my laboratory, take all the documentations, the files that they finally gather. And in another step, maybe next year, we may do a research project on the content of those files, but we are not there yet. It's, as you can imagine, a very sensitive subject, and we want to make sure that the families are aware and knows what we may do with all this information, but for sure, it has to be documented and recorded somewhere, because it's, yeah, happened too many times, and yeah, that's the upcoming other hard file, I will say, of that Indigenous people of Canada are facing. And you can add on that, you may have heard of it through the news, the founding of hundreds of graves, unmarked graves, on residential school land most of the time, but not always, since 2 years now, yeah. The Pope came last summer, so the year before. So still going through these kind of research with women in this case. They all have a story of or sterilizations, or residential school attending, or a baby lost in the health system, or, you know, you can imagine the accumulations of trauma that these person and their family are going through, and still going through today. Here's 2 slides of references, so I can easily give it to you, Inga, and you can share it with the students and professors. So everything I said, or nearly, is based, not based, but well, these references help to do all the research that I just talked about. So, Koyak, thank you very much. Atikamekw means thank you.